So hi everyone, welcome and thank you for attending this ISES webinar presented by Dr. Daniel Sullivan. His talk is entitled Findings from a Systematic Review of Chronic Environmental Contamination, Psychosocial Stress, and Community Resilience. So my name is Nicole Tolvey and I am chair of the International Society of Exposure Science Membership Committee, and I will be moderating this webinar. For those of you who are not society members, please consider joining the society, as we offer many benefits to our members, including exclusive access to this recorded webinar after the live performance today. So a few quick housekeeping notes before we get started. In the upper right-hand corner of your computer screen, you'll see your control panel. Please note that the webinar is in listen-only mode. And throughout the presentation, you can type a question into the questions section, and it will be answered at the end of the session. If you're having any kind of technological issue, please type that into the chat, and the chat will be monitored throughout the webinar. At the end of Dr. Sullivan's talk, we will have a Q&A. So as I mentioned earlier, we will be hearing from Dr. Sullivan today. So Dr. Sullivan received his PhD in psychology from the University of Kansas in 2013. His research concerns cultural differences in experiences of threatening events, such as illness, trauma, natural disaster, and environmental contamination. He is the author of over 100 scholarly works in psychology and the humanities. Since 2019, he has worked with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry on the Community Stress and Resilience Project concerning psychosocial consequences of chronic contamination. He is also involved with the Environmental Justice Collaborative at the University of Arizona's Mellon Enid Zuckerman College of Public Health, which was founded by Dr. Paloma Beamer and works on community issues surrounding historical contamination in Southside Tucson. So with that, I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Sullivan. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Nicole. Of course, people feel free to let me know if you can't hear me or if you're having any issues. So thanks very much to the ISES for this invitation. Thanks again to Nicole and Caitlin for making sure that everything is going smoothly on the technological side. And also special thanks to my colleague, Dr. Paloma Beamer, who encouraged me to present to this group. So for starters, just to define a key term before I launch into it, when I talk about chronic environmental contamination today, or CEC as I'll sometimes call it for short, I'm referring to the experience of living in an area where hazardous substances are known to be present in air, water, or soil at elevated levels. And this contamination can be chemical or radiological. It could be the result of industrial processes or a technological accident. So the typical example of what I'd be talking about would be living for years on or around a Superfund site. And today I'm going to be speaking about work, as Nicole mentioned, that I've done with the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, specifically with their Community Stress and Resilience Project, which is spearheaded by Ben Gerhardstein. And my graduate student, Harrison Schmidt, and I were recruited by this project to perform what's really the first major systematic literature review on psychological stress as a result of contamination experience. And in carrying out this project, we've been guided by some open questions, in particular by the topic of how to mitigate stress in communities that have been impacted by contamination. So to give you a map of the presentation, I'm going to start in just a moment by overviewing in a little more detail what we already knew from the social, scientific, and psychological literatures about psychological stress and contamination before I started our own review project. I'm then going to spend the remainder of my time talking about the preliminary answers to some open questions that my colleagues and I considered important, which we've arrived at through our own systematic review. And then finally, I'll conclude with some speculations on how the COVID-19 pandemic is impacting these processes and what it means for us moving into the future. So turning first to an overview of what we already knew when my colleagues and I started this project, we know that living in a community impacted by chronic contamination can be stressful, at least for some community members, and for some community members, it's a significant source of stress. And evidence for this came from early studies using a variety of methods They looked at the impact of events like the nuclear incident at 3 Mile Island or chemical spills in Northern California and Texas. And early researchers in this area, such as Henry Viner or Michael Edelstein, really emphasized and identified the unique kind of stress that is caused by potential exposure to contamination. Specifically, they stressed the invisible, uncertain nature of this exposure and the potential for lifelong health effects and how this can be very stressful. Another thing that social scientists had found repeatedly as a source of unique stress in this context is what Kroll-Smith and Couch referred to as community corrosion, which refers to the experience of a community debating and experiencing conflict over how to define contamination and what to do in response to it. And these observations underscore the fact that it's really important to keep in mind that the stress caused by chronic or potentially caused by chronic contamination differs quite a bit from the stress that people experience in reaction to more acute events, which are more widely studied in the psychological literature. For example, experiencing chronic contamination differs quite a bit from the prototypic experience of an environmental hazard such as a natural disaster. Scientific literature suggests that people's psychological reactions to natural disaster follow a fairly predictable time course, and that the majority of people are psychologically recovered within about a year after living through a natural disaster, especially if they aren't bereaved in the course of that disaster. But on the other hand, the chronic contamination experience can last for decades. Individuals can be caught in repeat cycles and ongoing stress experiences as more people learn about the contamination, as remediation efforts become prolonged, as new contaminants of concern are identified, or as loved ones succumb to long-term health effects. So again, it's really important to keep in mind throughout this presentation that chronic contamination is a unique experience that might contribute to unique forms of stress. We've also learned a lot in the last few decades about the existence of environmental injustice in the United States and of course around the world. But focusing just on the US context, we know that members of disadvantaged groups, such as ethnic racial minorities or lower income individuals, are disproportionately exposed to various forms of contamination. And evidence for this comes from a variety of studies, longitudinal and cross-sectional surveys at the state and national level, as well as more detailed case studies of particular metropolitan areas. And what's more, several environmental health scholars have put forward what's called a double jeopardy thesis, which essentially states that disadvantaged communities are at special risk for experiencing interactive effects of stress and contamination because the people in these communities are both more likely to be exposed to contaminants in the first place, but in addition, they're more likely to already have other sources of stress in their lives. And building on this theme, the third thing that we really kind of knew already going into this project was that there are really severe, potentially cascading negative effects of chronic stress on physical health. And in particular, the late Bruce McEwen put forward the concept of allostatic load or overload. And this refers to the idea that when the body encounters stressors on a frequent daily basis, it has to keep working overtime, so to speak, to maintain homeostasis. And this eventually leads to a wear and tear on the stress response system and the body in general. So we can think about a couple different ways in which this happens. Research suggests that the bodily response to acute stress, what we think of as the classic fight or flight system, evolved in part to boost the immune system and help us cope with dangerous situations. So it's generally functional. However, what we found is that chronic stress eventually starts to interfere with the functioning of the immune system. And it happens often either by suppressing immune system responses or by leading to heightened inflammatory responses. And both of these pathways can make us more susceptible to various kinds of illness, such as autoimmune disease in the case of immune dysregulation, or cancer in the case of immune suppression. And zooming out even further, McEwen's allostatic load model suggests that chronic activation of our stress system has domino effects on what he calls the nonlinear network of stress response mediators. And what this means is that the normal stress response we have in reaction to an acute stressor involves an interconnected network of systems, which are shown in the center of this diagram here. But when we're chronically stressed over time, any one of these systems can become dysregulated and have cascading effects on the other systems with which it's interconnected. And this has the potential to lead to a variety of deleterious health effects, ranging from the immune problems that I mentioned on the previous slide to problems with metabolism or even with basic cognitive functioning. So just to sum up this fairly rapid overview of what we knew going into this project, we know chronic contamination causes stress, at least for some people in the community. We know disadvantaged communities are more vulnerable to this. And furthermore, the chronic stress involved in this experience could be one of many factors leading to health disparities in the United States. So I'm going to devote the rest of my time to answering some open questions that we know less about through our own systematic review project. So the first question that we were really interested in is determining what is the exact degree of psychological stress impact of experiencing contamination. So early studies, for example, were mixed on the question of whether or not this experience could cause stress at clinically significant levels. And so we wanted to get a more precise answer to this question by conducting a systematic review of the available literature and an exploratory meta-analysis. The second question I'll turn to later in the presentation was what exactly are the major pathways for risk and resilience for stress in this context? And to answer this question, we drew on the literature that we gathered in our systematic review, as well as ATSDR's practical knowledge base of working over the years with communities that have been impacted by contamination and examining stress in those communities in particular. So we've started to develop preliminary models for how to identify who's most at risk for stress in these communities, and also recommendations for how to intervene to increase resilience in these communities in a way that's sensitive to psychosocial factors. And our work on both of these questions is being presented in manuscripts, which are currently under review at some major journals. So launching into the first open question that we were interested in, again, we were interested in the degree or severity of psychological impact of chronic contamination. And we wanted to answer this question using a systematic review approach to literature that's been published since 1995, which was the last time that ATSDR performed a major review of this particular topic. So we sought to gather as many quantitative studies as we could find that in some way assess the effect of chronic contamination on psychological stress-related outcomes. And here specifically are the criteria that we used for including studies. Now, we anticipated that the number of studies that would fit these specific criteria would be relatively small, and also that it would probably have certain methodological limitations and risk of bias. So when I say that we're doing a systematic review here, I don't mean to say that we intended to find a definitive answer to our research question, nor that we intended to grade the quality of the evidence and provide specific policy recommendations and so on. Instead, we felt that using a systematic review methodology would be the best way to take stock of the evidence that we currently have and identify at least some preliminary answers to our question. But it's important to kind of state at the outset that there are certain limitations to this literature, which I'll talk about in a moment, which limit our ability to make sort of conclusive statements based on this literature. So this diagram maps out our review process, and I should acknowledge that this work was done in close collaboration with the Gretchen Swanson Center for Nutrition in Nebraska, which is one of ATSDR's partners on this project. And we had 4 reviewers working on this systematic review, and together we screened about 4,000 articles that came up when we entered our initial search criteria into the major databases. After we applied our exclusion criteria, we ended up with a modest but workable pool of just under 40 studies to examine in more detail that came out in the last 25 years on this topic. So what does the pool of studies look like? The majority of them came from the United States, but there was also some representation of Europe, Australia, and South Korea. When it comes to the kind of contamination experience that was being investigated in these studies, about half of them were looking at communities that had been impacted by some kind of ongoing or historic industrial activity, such as Superfund site communities. But there was also some representation of communities that experienced major technological accidents where there had been some exposure. And when we look at the study designs that were employed, here's where we start to see some of the potential limitations of this literature. Most of the studies were cross-sectional. They were correlational studies of a population experiencing contamination at a single moment in time. And so there were relatively few examples of what we might think of as more robust study designs for this type of work, such as case control studies, in which a exposed sample was carefully matched to a control non-exposed sample. So remember that the primary question that we're interested in here is the average or typical severity of impact, psychological impact of living with chronic contamination. And we felt that the best way to really get at this question would be to use a meta-analytic technique. In other words, to sum up all the effects from our different studies and calculate a weighted average. And again, given the limitations I've been referring to, we didn't expect this to provide a definitive once and for all answer to our question, but we thought it would at least give an approximation of what we can say based on the data that's available. And to do this, we needed to limit our pool of studies even further to meet certain additional criteria. So in particular, the study to be included in our meta-analysis had to include an independent variable that in some way operationalize the experience of contamination. So it's important to remember that when I talk about weighted averages, average effects in these data, what I'm talking about is an independent variable that was operationalized in different ways. That's really an amalgamation of different types of experiences and measures. So in some studies, there were actual objective measures of people's exposure, such as the level of arsenic that was measured in people's well water. But in other studies, there were simply subjective measures, such as people's self-report of the extent to which they think their water was impacted or contaminated. In some studies, the independent variable was people's residential distance from the source of exposure. In some cases, it was the amount of time people had spent living in the contamination impacted area, and so on and so forth. Now, second, to be included in our meta-analysis, the study had to report an effect on a dependent variable or an outcome that could in some way be conceptualized as measuring psychological stress. We categorized the studies on this variable in 3 different general ways. So we came across very few studies that actually had like physiological indicators of stress or results from clinical interviews. So we were mostly forced to rely on self-report measures from scales and various survey instruments. Some of these studies included pretty well validated self-report measures of depressive symptoms or post-traumatic stress symptoms connected to experiencing contamination. But many of the studies simply had somewhat ad hoc measures, either validated or not, of what we could generally just think of as feeling stressed or feeling anxious as a result of contamination. And so for all those effects, we simply grouped them into a catch-all category that we just refer to as general stress and anxiety. And in the end, when we polled all the effects that meet these specific criteria from our pool of studies, we end up with 50 effects representing a total combined sample of data from about 20,000 people. Okay, so what did we find from this exploratory meta-analysis? Well, we calculated the average effect of all the different operationalizations of contamination experience on the different operationalizations of stress. We adjusted for factors such as variation in sample size across the studies. And when we do that, the total effect we find of experiencing chronic contamination on stress is small but statistically significant. So it's a Pearson's R of about 0.2, correlation of about 0.2. Now, when you break this down specifically according to the different kinds of psychological measures we looked at, the number bounces around a little bit, but in each case it remains statistically significant. So what does this small significant effect mean? Well, we think it confirms what lots of people working in these kinds of communities have noted over the years, which is that there is a fair amount of variation within communities in terms of how stressed people are by living with contamination. So some people experience quite a bit of stress from this. Others don't necessarily worry about it that much, at least not in connection or in comparison to other kinds of stressors in their lives. And of the people who do experience stress, probably the majority of them are not experiencing it at what we might think of as sort of clinically significant thresholds for conditions like post-traumatic stress disorder. But nevertheless, the potential for stress in these communities is very real, it's robust, it's statistically significant. And furthermore, variation within these different studies suggests that there probably are a subset of community members in any given community who could develop conditions like depression or even PTSD based on their experience of living with chronic contamination. So just looking at the data in a little bit more detail, here at the bottom of the slide is a depiction of the overall effect averaged across the different psychological outcomes. And we look here specifically at the effects from the studies that measured general stress and anxiety as a dependent variable. We see that the overall weighted effect from these studies basically matches the total effect across all measures. If we focus in on those studies that assessed depression specifically, the effect is a little bit smaller on average, but still significant and basically in the same range. Interestingly, when we focus on post-traumatic stress symptoms from the studies that measured this, the effect is a little bit larger on average, but this could possibly be an artifact of the fact that the studies that assessed PTSD were often studies of communities that had experienced a technological disaster. And so to some extent, this response may be unique to the experience of living through a technological disaster, might not be as representative of the experience of, say, living in a site of ongoing slow chronic contamination. So having presented all these results, again, I kind of hasten to say that there are some limitations to this particular body of work that's out there. And these limitations really reflect, on the one hand, the inherent difficulties of looking at stress in this kind of context, and the fact that more funding and rigor is needed in research on this question. For instance, the meta-analysis indicated that there was a fair amount of heterogeneity in studies, meaning that basically there was a fair amount of inconsistency in how people were operationalizing the experience of contamination and the outcome of stress across these different studies. There's also significant evidence of risk of bias in the studies. For example, only about half the studies had some kind of objective measure of actual exposure to contamination, as opposed to relying to more subjective self-reported indicators. And related to this, there are definitely some issues with sampling bias in the studies, meaning that researchers often had to recruit participants through means like contacting them at community meetings. And so in many instances, they were probably oversampling from individuals who are likely to be concerned about this particular issue. But bearing all these limitations in mind, we nevertheless think that there are some pretty important implications of our results. And most important, we think it's accurate to say that there's a robust, statistically significant effect of experiencing contamination on psychological stress. So even if you take into account all the literature limitations that I've been mentioning, it's very unlikely, given our results, that there's no real effect of experiencing contamination on psychological outcomes in communities. And for this reason, we really believe that future research should be conducted investigating the psychological impact of chronic contamination. We think there's pretty clear evidence that this is posing an additional health burden on communities, that stress, as I've said in the beginning of the presentation, can contribute independently to worse physical health outcomes. And so we really need to identify ways to intervene in these communities, to serve them, that take into account the stress people may be feeling, and certainly don't do anything to exacerbate it. So as mentioned, one of the reasons we think that the overall effect of contamination on stress is somewhat small is because there's a lot of variability within communities and how people react to experiencing this. So a valid question that I'm turning to now is, what does the literature say about the pathways for stress, the risk pathways? Who's most likely to experience stress in this context? And we think it's important to think about how people are at risk for stress on both a material and a social dimension of contamination impact. So when we focus on the material or the physical level, if you will, it's clear from the studies we've assembled that one of the biggest risk factors for experiencing stress from contamination is attributing health impacts of the contamination either to oneself or one's family, or to being very concerned about the possibility of health impacts. So for example, here is just a graphical depiction of the studies that assessed concern with health specifically, or health impacts. And we see that the overall average effect of being worried about your health in the context of contamination is fairly large, an R of about 0.3. At the same time, we think it's also very important to think about the social dimension of this experience, because many studies suggest that the social process of interacting with institutions and officials who can sometimes delegitimize people's experiences is also a significant stressor. So in short, we think the people who are at greatest risk for contamination-related stress are those who believe that their health has been negatively impacted by contamination, but who also have the experience of interacting with experts or officials who delegitimize or downplay those health concerns in some way. So let me talk about this social dimension a little bit more, since it might be a little bit more novel to you. But Henry Viner, who was a scholar who worked on the psychological experience of contamination in the early 80s, identified several sources of what he called institutional delegitimization and how it's a source of stress. So sometimes this can take the form of very blatant denial. For example, responsible parties are often incentivized to dispute the possibility that health effects can be attributed to contamination. And so citizens, residents can experience denial of their health concerns, but it can also take much more subtle forms. So for example, Viner talked about what he called dysfunctional medical relationships. So healthcare providers in a community, for example, might not be familiar with the details of the contamination. And so when interacting with concerned residents, they may dismiss their concerns as the result of hypochondria, or they might even just attribute them to stress. And furthermore, many people who live in communities impacted by contamination often have the perception that they are being at least partially blamed for health outcomes that their community is experiencing. And this happens commonly, for example, when people hear messaging suggesting that it's their lifestyle in the community that is causing certain health problems, as opposed to involuntary exposures through industrial activity, for example. And overall, a pretty clear picture emerges, especially from more qualitative or ethnographic studies that we looked at in these communities, suggesting that one of the major sources of stress in the contamination experience is experiencing a loss of trust in institutions that you previously believed would protect you in situations like this. So it can be a loss of trust in a corporation that employs the majority of people in the community. It can be a loss of trust in government or public health. But this is consistently identified as a major source of people's stress, again, kind of underscoring the importance of paying attention to the social dimension of the chronic contamination experience. We also found some effects in our review that basically replicate things that were observed in earlier literature. So for example, we often find that women, self-identified women, are more stressed by contamination than self-identified men. And people like Evelyn Bromett have argued for quite some time that this occurs in part because people are generally very concerned about the impact of contamination on their children, and mothers are often especially sensitive to this possibility. Now, most of the quantitative studies we looked at were conducted in relatively racially homogeneous communities, and so they weren't really able to speak to the question of environmental justice effects. But if you look at qualitative studies from the past 25 years that have focused specifically on the perspective of racial and ethnic minority communities, these studies often find that a major source of stress is a belief in these communities that racism has either allowed the contamination to occur in the first place or has shaped a relatively ineffective response to the contamination. So further kind of documentation of the importance of environmental justice here. So what are the ultimate implications of these findings? What do we do with them? Well, some people definitely experience stress in this context, and we know about the kinds of experiences that lead them to experience stress. How can we mitigate it and the health burden that it creates? So my colleagues at ATSDR and I are working on a model for how to intervene in communities that have been impacted by contamination to increase resilience in ways that are sensitive to these psychosocial issues. Now, it's really important to say that we don't think that attending to stress should take the place of the very important work of limiting exposure, remediating communities, addressing people's physical health effects, getting out scientific information to the community, and so on. Rather, we think that all that important work can be done in ways that are sensitive to the stress that people may be experiencing, and that this sensitivity will increase the success of that work. So with these goals in mind, we've put together a model of how public health professionals, environmental scientists, and other working in contamination and impacted communities can address these psychosocial issues. There are three kind of broad principles that we've identified that we refer to as recognize, prepare, and partner for working in these communities. And I'll just briefly overview each of these and some steps people can take to impact them. So first and foremost, we think it's important to recognize the stress that people may be experiencing and to prevent negative secondary impacts. So people working in these communities as outsiders have to recognize that whatever they do, for better or for worse, they're going to be part of the community's secondary impact experience. And so they can either intervene in ways that will increase people's feelings of stress by delegitimizing their concerns, or they can ameliorate that stress by behaving and speaking in an empathetic way. And one way to do this is simply to acknowledge that stress is a very normal response to the abnormal experience of living through contamination. And in some communities, people may not have ways to talk about this or recognize it at first, but that's something you can work with in a community and share information about if it's something that you find the community might be interested in discussing. And at the same time, the classic principles of effective risk communication that have been developed by CDC and others are still very important in this context. People often feel delegitimized when someone is communicating risk to them, an expert in a town hall meeting. And so it's really important to share risk messaging without inadvertently conveying delegitimizing messages. It's also very important to prepare for the unique impact and time course of chronic contamination. So as I've mentioned, the chronic contamination experience can last for decades sometimes. And so people intervening in communities need to build relationships and interventions in the communities that can last. And at the same time, people need to be aware of the possibility that community members may experience re-traumatization, for example. So over the years, as loved ones succumb to health effects or as new contaminants of concern are revealed, people may experience the stress all over again. And so this is something that people have to recognize, that the experience of chronic contamination is different from other kinds of stressors, and they need to intervene in community in a way that is sensitive to this. And an important way to do this is by partnering with community leaders and community groups. These types of resources can be important sources of information or social support. For example, some case studies suggest that you can even create informal social support groups in the community to address psychological issues, and that sometimes these can be very effective. And in general, a lot of case studies suggest that it's good to utilize more informal outreach and support means. And what I mean by this is that people often feel delegitimized again in sort of a town hall setting where they feel like an outside expert is speaking down to them. And so some people have found that by doing things like teach-ins or health fairs or support groups, this can be an important way to get out information about contamination and about limiting exposure, but also giving people an opportunity to recognize and address the stress they may be experiencing. Now, something that a lot of you or some of your colleagues might be interested to know is that, again, this literature review is really just part of a broader stress and resilience project that is spearheaded by Ben Gerhardstein at ATSDR. And one of the things that we're doing as part of this project is compiling what is essentially going to be a central repository for all kinds of information about these issues. So really a central hub online that people can navigate to implement the strategies that I've been talking about on the immediately previous slides. So it'll include manuals and fact sheets and all kinds of information that could be helpful for people who have to work in contaminated communities and want to be sensitive to the stress that people may be experiencing in these communities. This resource center, this online hub, is still under review and development at ATSDR. But Ben has told me that he's hoping it will be online and available to the public as early as October. So that's something you might look for if you are the type of person who's working in these communities and wants to think about this stuff. Now, I don't want to take too long because I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I did want to conclude by mentioning a few speculations that I've been having recently about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on stress in the context of contamination. So first of all, I think this is a very important historical moment for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons in our own sort of corner of the world is that suddenly everyone really knows what it's like to experience chronic stress. So this is something which, as I've mentioned, has not been as widely researched in psychology. Psychology tends to focus on acute stress events like natural disasters or bereavement. And I think this is a major gap in our understanding. And now I think we've appreciated the significance of that gap. When there's a stressor that unfolds continuously over months or potentially years and people don't know when it's going to end, and when they start to lose faith in institutions and government and things that are supposed to protect them from this kind of event, this is a very different kind of stress experience. It has a very different effect on the body from just living through a tornado or a hurricane one time, for example. And so I hope that in the future, psychologists and others will really recognize the importance of studying chronic stress. At the same time, we already have a lot of evidence emerging that, and this is no surprise to the people listening to me, I'm sure, that environmental justice is still an issue in the context of COVID. For example, people in public health at Harvard have been putting out this great data that they periodically update, showing that a history of air pollution exposure in a community increases the mortality rate from COVID. There's, I think, going to be a lot of emergent evidence that communities that have historically been impacted by contamination and stressed by it are now also more likely to be impacted by COVID. I know that in Southside Tucson, where I do some work in the community, people are feeling especially stressed for two unique reasons. One is that they feel very anxious about the possibility of contracting COVID. They're living in an area where there are higher potential rates of COVID exposure. And at the same time, many of them are immunocompromised or have physical conditions that they've attributed to a contamination. And as a result, they're very anxious about the possibility of contracting COVID. But secondly, they're also concerned, some of them, that COVID is going to distract from the important work of remediating the environment. They're concerned that because of all the attention and funding that rightly needs to go into combating COVID, that other emergent problems that they've been working to solve over the years, such as perfluorinated compounds, are going to now be shelved. And so, as has happened in the past, they feel like their experience may be marginalized and that the things they worry about are going to be ignored. So again, I'm presumably speaking to the choir here, but I think it's really important for all of us to recognize and make clear to people in power that the environmental justice issues in this country and in the world, the public health disparities, the public health system in general as it functions in the United States, really has certain limitations that practically and politically cost the country. They certainly are not wise in terms of economic development moving forward into the future, but at the same time, they're morally unacceptable in terms of the impact that continues to happen on communities that have historically borne the brunt of technological and industrial development. So I'll stop at that. I know it's a lot of information. I want to acknowledge, again, all my colleagues at ATSDR who really let this work come into being, the people who worked on the lit review, especially my graduate student, Harrison Schmidt, and several other people who facilitated this project. Thank you very much for listening to me today. If you don't get a chance to ask your question now, feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you when I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan, for a very interesting and informative presentation. So we'll now move to the question and answer portion of today's webinar. So I'll give people a chance to type in their questions. And we actually have one question in the box. Okay, it looks it's a little long. Let me okay, here goes. Proximity to contamination does not necessarily mean that it is the cause of health effects in the community. So how do you speak to that community without delegitimizing their unfounded concern? Question is asked in the context where known effects of a contaminant do not include those alleged by the community.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I think that's a really difficult question. I think that, and that was the whole question, right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Do you want me to read it again, or is it?
No, that's, I mean, yeah, I think I have the gist of it. So, yeah, so first of all, I mean, just kind of based on some of the things I was talking about, we know that the communities that are more likely to experience contamination, or at least live in proximity to contamination, are also statistically more likely to be disadvantaged in a number of ways, which psychologists, of course, know contributes to the possibility of things like stress and depression. So, I mean, in some of the studies, there's effort made to control for these kinds of effects and to show unique impact of contamination on stress above and beyond other kinds of factors like social class and so on. But that's definitely something that we need to be very careful and attend to in research of this kind, because stress is, of course, a composite phenomenon that results from all kinds of factors. I think one thing I personally am an advocate of is the idea that stress is real and can have real effects, whether it's simply as a result of concern, right? So people who are highly concerned that they've been exposed or that they've had health effects from exposure are likely to experience the same kind of deleterious stress as people who have been truly exposed, if that makes sense. So the stress and its impact can be real, even if it's something that a person has imagined and that has not, or that we could never say objectively happened to them. So the question is a very good one. If you're very clear that exposure has not been the cause of health effects in a given community, how do you speak to people in a way that doesn't delegitimize their concerns? I can't claim to have an exact, succinct answer as to how to do that, and I'm not an expert in risk communication myself. I do think that there's significant evidence from people like Phil Brown and his students and colleagues suggesting that communities really want to get full information from experts, from scientists, from public health professionals. They want to hear the truth, and they're generally, for the most part, pretty receptive to the truth, even when it's complicated, even when it involves a lot of uncertainty. So I do think it's very important to be transparent with people. And that one of the major sources of delegitimization is people feeling that experts are not being transparent with them. So I really think the best strategy is to try to maintain a long-term, transparent relationship of concern with people in that community. So let them know that you care about them, that you acknowledge the things that have into them the things that are sources of stress in their lives, but present them the data that you have and be willing to work with them and answer their questions. I think that's the best I can say. And of course, it's not a very succinct answer, but hopefully it's of some help.
Thank you. So the next question is, what sorts of quantitative exposure metrics were employed in studies included in the meta-analysis?
So yeah, generally speaking, there were relatively few of those. And as I said, for the most part, they were just measurements taken in people's homes. So for the example that I recall, there was levels of arsenic in private well water that were being measured. But yeah, I'd have to go back and review the specifics of the studies to come up with what the indicators were in those studies. But this was, a fairly small minority of the effects that went into our calculating our average. So it's definitely something that we acknowledge as a limitation of the literature, that in many cases we're drawing on people's either their self-report of exposure or the fact that they live in a community that has exposure. So there's a source of exposure in the community as opposed to in a separate community that does not have an obvious source of exposure.
Okay, thank you. So the next question has multiple parts. How on earth do you tease out the stress from contamination, COVID, and the toxicity of what's going on at the national level? Or does it even matter because stress is just stress? I have never seen so many people under so much stress before.
So that's the first part, or is that all the parts?
That's all the parts.
Well, I mean, I think it's spot on. And I think what's important for me is, in the work that I do anyway, is continuing to acknowledge that certain communities in our country were already experiencing double jeopardy before COVID. And so now we can think of it as, triple, quadruple jeopardy. I mean, certainly I think there are many people who I talk to in these kinds of communities who are very stressed, not only by the possibility of contracting COVID, but by their just general concern for what is happening to the environment, which of course many of them attribute to the current administration. So people are very concerned about, the environment that they've been working to protect for most of their lives, or that they've, become very invested in as a result of living through the experience of contamination. I think exactly as the questioner said, on some level, this all just accumulates, but I still think it's very important. The more stress, the more sources of stress you have, the more difficult it becomes to cope with. And I think it just really, what's important to keep in mind is that the stress itself is a significant health burden. And so the more we can think about it, the more we can try to keep it in mind when we're working with these kinds of communities, the more we can do to mitigate it, the better. Because there are certainly people who I think, just anecdotally, I don't have great evidence for it, but there are people who I believe are suffering more from their stress about abstract things like worrying about the future of the environment than they necessarily are from their own personal experience of health effects, if that makes sense. So I think it's a really important thing that we need to keep in mind and not forget about.
Okay, thank you. Did you come across any study focusing on contamination for indigenous and tribal communities? And are these groups that we should prioritize?
So I certainly think that these kinds of communities are important to prioritize. Most of the studies that we found in our literature review, for whatever reason, did not speak specifically to those communities. But at least in my home state of Arizona, there's a very long history of people, for example, in the Navajo community, being concerned about these kinds of issues. With mining of various forms impacting their environments and leading to potential health effects. And now, of course, dealing with COVID at potentially disproportionate rates. So I do think communities such as these need to be prioritized, and their experience is very important and in some ways often emblematic of the environmental justice issues that I was speaking about in the presentation. I do know there are some studies looking, for example, at more remote or rural indigenous communities which have examined the food burden and the public health effects of diet that can be uniquely experienced by these communities, where they, for various reasons, may be unable to practice kinds of dieting that they've done in their land for years due to contamination. So they may not be able to fish anymore, for example, and that this can lead to public health issues. Also that bottled water may be a priority or something that the community wants but has difficulty accessing. And I will just say there's a very good book by Elizabeth Hoover, I think is her name, who worked with Phil Brown and did some work in the New York area, I believe, with indigenous people on the topic of contamination. So I would really recommend Hoover's work as a way of looking at this from a psychological perspective.
Okay, thank you. What is the anticipated timeline on the ATSDR stress toolkit you mentioned?
So yeah, it's under review and development, but Ben Gerhardstein tells me that it should be available in October, hopefully. And so that's something where if someone has interest in it, and they can reach out to me or to Ben at ATSDR would probably be the best thing. I've seen, the website has basically been constructed and all the information has been compiled. So I think it's basically just going through the review process, the clearance process at ATSDR, but hopefully that'll be out there pretty soon. And I think it will be a great sort of central hub for all the pieces of information we've been able to find on how to address this particular issue.
Okay, thanks.
Sure.
Any thoughts on the interactions between environmental and social stressors on chronic stress? And were you able to find any information on that interaction in your research?
That's a very good question. So that was something we were really interested in going into the project. And unfortunately, in the pool of studies that we found, there wasn't a lot of great data speaking to it. There's an ongoing project, I forget the name of the project, but there's some data that came out of Texas City in the last 10 years or so, kind of speaking to this issue, where they're able to get pretty good indices of exposure, but also physiological indices, as well as psychological measures of stress. I think that the literature on lead exposure and psychological outcomes also speaks to this issue. Perhaps somewhat indirectly, but I think that's probably the best kind of body of evidence. Yeah, I think, it seems pretty clear based on the lead literature and the few things we've seen about, other sorts of environmental contamination, that there are definitely interactive effects here. And this is where, the double jeopardy thesis really stems from, that, you can have physiological impact on the body through exposure, which is then exacerbated by stress and the impact that stress has on the body. So I think it's something where in literature on Superfund sites specifically, for example, we could definitely use more data and data with multiple methods and taking better indices of exposure into account. But I think it's something that's a very live idea and makes a lot of sense, that one of the reasons these communities are especially burdened is because the stress they're experiencing is likely increasing the impact that the contaminants are having on their body.
Great, thank you. Just a quick announcement. One of the listeners actually suggested that there's another good book on indigenous communities called Everyday Exposure by Sarah Webb. So for those of you that are interested in indigenous communities, there's a potential reference for you.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually don't know that one, so that's very good to hear.
Yeah, W-I-E-B-E is the spelling of her last name. So last call for any questions for Daniel. People have a few seconds here to type. All right, I don't see any any typing going on. So I'd like to thank you, Daniel, for a very interesting webinar. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this month's webinar. And please be reminded, in the next few days, you'll receive an email from ISES that includes a link to evaluate the webinar. And please take a moment to provide your feedback. We're always looking for ideas on webinar topics. So please, if there's a topic you'd like to hear about, if there's a speaker that you are aware of who I could contact, please provide their information. The recording of today's webinar, along with the handouts, will be posted on the ISES members only portal after the webinar is completed. And then a last reminder, the Society has officially gone virtual for this year's annual meeting, and it will be held online September 21st and 22nd. And with that, I thank you and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you very much, everybody.